All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of A Sip of Knowledge with Lou Bryson flying solo this week. I believe Liz Rhoades is at an event, but
And,
joining
and, and
him.
I'm insulted.
I
I'm
was getting, I
insulted.
was getting
I,
to you,
I,
Sam. Lou
I
is
finally
flying solo
I
as
finally get on
he's
this
flying
show and
solo
Liz
as the
is not
host this
here.
week. Sam is joining as a special guest, Sam Komlenic. So Lou's going to give a more formal introduction to him in just a moment. Before I turn things over, though, I'm Will Hookinga from Zavvy.co. As always, just want to point out a few ways that you can interact with each other, with Lou, with Sam throughout the show today. So on your right, you'll see a chat box. Feel free to say hello and let us know where you're joining us from in the world. At the bottom of the screen, there's a button that says Ask a Question. So if you do have a question at any point during the show, just hit that button, type your question in. I'll be keeping an eye out for those throughout the show today. And last but not least, you can invite your friends to join us. Always a fun thing to do. There's a share button at the top that makes it easy to do that. But with that said, Lou, it's all yours.
Thanks, Will. I am Lou Bryson, star of stage and screen. I've been writing about whiskey since about 1996, and I have my two books. This is the latest one, Whiskey Masterclass, a deep dive into the creation of flavor and aroma in whiskey. And this is my first book, Tasting Whiskey, which is more of an overview of the entire thing. And today, for the first time, I'm going to mention that both those books were edited by my buddy Sam Komlenic here. And when I say, as usual, that I was managing editor of Whiskey Advocate for 20 years, Sam, you've been copy editing Whiskey Advocate for how long?
This is my 16th year.
There we go. So Sam and I have been in harness together for quite a while. We are both Pennsylvanians. We are both whiskey drinkers, both beer drinkers, and as you can see, we're both pretty jovial big guys too. So
large and in charge.
Yeah, that's enough said about that. Sam, why do we have Sam on here? It's not because he's the copy editor of Whiskey Advocate. It's not because he edited both my books very ably, which, I mean, Sam is a stickler for copy, for grammar, for punctuation. We used to call him Captain Hyphen at the magazine. You knew that,
Shut
right?
up. Shut up.
But Sam also has a broad and encyclopedic knowledge of whiskey and whiskey making, which made him invaluable to us because he could also help with fact checking on pieces, which is exactly, of course, why I had him help with the books. Sam is from Ruffs Dale, Pennsylvania, the home of Dillinger Distilling. Dillinger Whiskey.
Dillinger Distilling.
Distilling, okay. Yeah. And is I don't know how else to put it. He's an amateur rye whiskey historian. And I only say amateur in the sense of the Olympic ideal. So he's not a professional, but he is right up there and working on it.
So, I've never been paid to do this. That makes me an amateur.
There you go. Which reminds me, one of the things Sam and I kind of talked about, set up before this, and I forgot to tell you, I always say each week what I'm drinking, what's in my glass. Well, today I have Old Overholt 114 proof rye whiskey, and I have the recent Dickel Leopold Brothers collaboration rye, which is a combination of three chamber still rye and column still rye. And the funny thing about this is, of course, that neither of them are Pennsylvania ryes.
Well, give me 1 second. Talk for a moment.
Certainly.
I'll be right back.
So the reason I brought out two non-Pennsylvania ryes is that both of them have roots here. I mean, obviously, any American rye whiskey has roots in Pennsylvania, but the Old Overholt, and we're going to talk about that. Old Overholt comes from West Overton Village. This is where This is where the brand is established. Will, if we could get
Actually,
that picture.
actually not true. The brand was not
Indeed.
the brand was not established until the later 1800s after Abraham's death, and Old Overholt was only produced at the Broadford distillery. You'll notice the West Overton distilling building says
Yes.
Old Farm Rye, Pure Rye, which was their brand at the time. So
That's why you're here, Sam.
Just for clarification, yes.
Absolutely. So the reason I got the Dickel and Leopold, well, one other than that, it's a really good whiskey. This is something we wanted to get into later in the show. This is one of the things we want to get to. The whole idea of the 3-chamber still and the effect it had on Pennsylvania and maybe Maryland rye, and how that's maybe coming back now. But first off, Sam, how did you get to where you are? Why are you? Why is this a fascination for you, rye whiskey history?
My bios of the great rye whiskey distilleries of Pennsylvania, and that is no exaggeration. That Dillinger distillery that still exists in the tiny little village that I'm essentially from is still there. It's an important distillery. I first saw the Overholt Broadford
and just
distillery.
To clarify, you mean the closed down distillery? It's not functioning.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. Yes. It closed. The distillery closed in 1947. The warehouses remained in usage for decades after that, or probably about 15 years. But my first view of the Overholt distillery at Broadford was on a canoe trip down the Yacht in 1972, and I was fascinated by what I saw. That was a year that yes.
When you say the Yacht, could you explain that for our listeners?
Yes, the Youghiogheny River, which is a tributary of the Monongahela. Thank you very much.
You bet.
I started to collect. I started collecting Pennsylvania distilling artifacts when I got my driver's license and could go to antique shops and flea markets, and it just went from there. And I've compiled what I think is probably the only database of historic Pennsylvania whiskey distillers. I continually update that, and my bottle collection of Pennsylvania rye whiskey bottles is around 225, and I'm getting ready to donate that to West Overton to go on exhibit. So it's been a big part of my life, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, as my repertoire expanded in American distilling, and I got to go to Whiskey Fest and meet all these distillers and become friends with a number of them. And much like yourself, I've learned an infinitesimal amount of knowledge from this experience of interaction. And, the fraternity of craft distillers is an amazing thing. And it's led to this. It's led to this. Here we are.
Yeah.
And before we go any further, I have to ask if it's intentional that the acronym of this program is the same as the name of the office lackey in Dilbert, the cartoon strip. His name is ASOK, ASOK.
No.
You said we're going to be on ASOK, and I'm thinking we're going to be in Dilbert.
Strictly a coincidence. No, we started out as what the heck was it? 3 Fingers of Knowledge, and people got their knickers in a twist about that. So we changed to this.
Here's my
Pennsylvania rye.
Since you don't have any Pennsylvania rye, I do. This is Dad's Hat Bottled in Bond, last year's edition, which you helped to pick.
Indeed.
If I recall, and it has been a delicious companion so far, and I'm sure will continue to be.
Yeah. So that brings us to, I've got a number of questions I want to try and get through. The first one is, why rye whiskey in Pennsylvania, bourbon in Kentucky? Or was it that simple?
Well, you read these really simplistic overviews that the soil in Pennsylvania is not as good for corn as it is in Kentucky, and that rye grows anywhere and it grows well here. And that's all true, but you and I have talked about this connection. Everybody talks about the Scots-Irish, the Scots-Irish, the Scots-Irish, the Scots-Irish. Well, there's a big German distilling tradition, and even though many of the farmer distillers were Scots-Irish, very few of them evolved into industrial distillers. The industrial distillers tended to be more Germanic, sometimes Swiss in origin, but they have a tradition over there of distilling rye whiskey to begin with. And so when they came here and grew their rye, they made whiskey from it like they would have done in the old country. And I believe that had as much to do with it as anything.
Yeah, I mean, you look at two of the biggest names in American whiskey, Beam and Overholt, both German, both Pennsylvania German.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you look at the distilleries that we will talk about later. Guggenheimer,
right?
German. Hamburger, German. There were so many of these that were German influenced operations. So
yeah. I guess we forgot about that after World War I when we were all eating Liberty cabbage.
Well, the Queen City Brewing Company in Cumberland, Maryland, was originally the German brewing company.
Wow.
And when World War I came, they changed the name to, I believe it was the Cumberland Brewing Company. And then they named it the German American Brewing Company until World War II came. And then they had to change the name again. So you're absolutely right.
Well, I got just to the whiskey. These two are so good and so different.
Huh.
The Overholt 114 is just screamingly spicy, and this the Dickel Leopold it's just deep. It's got this like gripping roundness to it. It's very different whiskeys.
Awesome.
Yeah. Sorry.
How do they do it?
How do they do it? Thank God they do. So another thing, while we're sticking pins in all these balloons of bullshit, we always hear. Sam, are you? Oh, you're looking at the.
Yes, I'm looking at the. Yeah, I'm looking at the questions here.
Well, so feel free to say hi to somebody if you want to.
Hey. Hi, Rich and Dave, back in Center County.
So let's stick a pin in this one. We keep getting told that after the Whiskey Rebellion, all these rebellious Pennsylvania distillers jumped on a flatboat and headed down the Ohio and started making bourbon in Kentucky.
Many of them did.
And yet, many of them were already doing it, right?
Many of them were already doing it. Absolutely. Yeah. There was very little bourbon making here in Pennsylvania, according to what I found. There are records of bourbon being made early on, but by very few distillers. And I'm not sure why that was. Obviously, they had the ability. They had you had corn in this horrible climate where you can't grow corn, but every field here is now full of corn. We don't have any rye growing in Pennsylvania to speak of. So,
what is growing is cover crop.
Right. Correct.
Largely. Yeah.
Not being grown for seed.
Yeah. So there were some that fled to Kentucky, but as I understand it, some of them kept on going right down to New Orleans.
There were some major distillers that moved from Pennsylvania to Kentucky. Jacob Spears was a distiller here and opened the Peacock Distillery, which is on the road between Paris and I can't remember the other town in Kentucky. The Paris Kaiser Road, I think, and his one of his warehouses is still standing from a Pennsylvania distiller that motored down the river to Kentucky. Daniel Shawhan was another one who had distilled in what was then Virginia, later West Virginia, moved to Pennsylvania, distilled in Pittsburgh, and then headed down the river. But there were already distilleries in Kentucky. It's not like the industry started from this. They have a very long distilling history in Kentucky, although it's not quite as long as ours.
And plenty of them stayed after the Whiskey Rebellion.
Absolutely, yeah. Plenty of them stayed after the Whiskey Rebellion, but some did trickle downstream. Absolutely.
trickle
But I don't think
downstream.
it was a
Very nice.
major. I don't think it was a major outflow of distillers.
Yeah,
It's not,
yeah,
because Kentucky was already a state too. They
yeah.
weren't.
It's
It's
just
not
a
like they were
general
outside of American
movement.
territory. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So you've already mentioned some of these Pennsylvania distillers, but I specifically wanted, if you could tell people about some of the really great Pennsylvania rice distillers that a lot of people probably don't know about. You always talk about Dillinger and Sam Thompson. Tell us about them and their fellow distillers, and why were they all clustered in southwestern PA? Was it just
You know,
because that's where they were, or
I can't really answer that. I can't really give you a concrete answer on that. But southwestern Pennsylvania was absolutely the concentration of was the concentration of distilleries was in place in that location. There was certainly distilling in Philadelphia and Bucks County, where these people, many of them, disembarked from on their journey west. But it didn't proliferate until it got to the frontier. And one thing people have to understand is that west of the Allegheny Mountains, it was a purely agrarian society. People did nothing but farm. So if everybody has as much grain as they need, grain has no value. You
right?
cannot sell grain on the frontier. And to transport that grain from the frontier to market cost as much to transport as the grain is worth in that market. So one had to value add to their farm to make something happen. And so,
And condense it so it's easier to carry.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So they started to distill. And people have heard that every farm had a still. It was an essential tool. No, stills were incredibly expensive and
Right.
very rare. And the best estimate that I can come up with is about 10% of farms on the frontier had a still. So much like a miller would do custom milling for you and perhaps take his pay in grain or flour.
Cider press, same thing.
The same with a still. Your neighbor would bring his grain, you'd distill his grain, you'd keep some of his grain or some of his whiskey, your choice,
Well, this is
So it
something
worked the same way.
I've learned recently. I've been traveling around Pennsylvania looking at covered bridges. I'm trying to get to all of
And
them.
you have yet to come to southwestern Pennsylvania.
I'm working on it because I want to come in and ruin your life for a few days.
Yes.
But the interesting thing is how many of these covered bridges are named so-and-so's mill covered bridge. And there are even, I know of at least one that is named, I can't remember the name, but somebody's distillery covered bridge.
Kaufman's Distillery
Kaufman's
in
Lancaster.
Lancaster County.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Kaufman's Distillery Bridge, which Pennsylvania Mictors created a covered bridge decanter.
Oh, good God, of course they did.
Yeah, they had a covered bridge decanter for Kaufman's Distillery Bridge.
So my point is that feeds into your not everybody had a distillery, because the reason those bridges were there for the cider mill and the distillery is so that everyone on the other side of the stream could get there. They were doing that to open up more traffic so people wouldn't go to another mill. They were making it easier to get to theirs because, like you said, not everybody had it. Hell, I mean, you can see signs in Amish country, and I've seen these signs, custom lima bean hulling.
Wow.
Because hulling lima beans is a pain in the ass. I can speak from experience.
Oh, it's
and
like
somebody will get the machine and they're like, yeah, come on by.
Huh.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's you make a great point there, and this is how commercial distilling developed.
Yes, absolutely.
So who were these guys?
These guys were farmers. They were frontiersmen. As I said, it was a purely agrarian society. There was no industry at that time. So much like today, everything comes from the earth, but the machinery, it was hard to get anything out there.
Yeah.
Until the railroads opened up and crossed the Alleghenies, it was really hard to get equipment west of the mountains. So, a millstone. Can you imagine hauling a millstone? God. It's coming from France. These the good millstones were not domestic. the best millstones came from France. And
Wow.
supposedly the folks at Indian Creek Distillery in Dayton,
Oh yeah.
if I recall correctly, they said that the stones for that mill in 1810 cost the equivalent of $250,000.
Wow.
So think about how much flour you've got to grind to make up $250,000 investment in your stones alone.
Yeah.
You know,
that's quite a pair of stones.
it was daunting. It was
Yeah.
daunting. So I believe this question started with talking about some of the distillers in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
We had talked about Dillinger, which is very dear to my heart and was an important distillery in that it was rebuilt around the repeal of Prohibition to include two separate and distinct distilleries. One was a column distillery with a beer still and a rectifying column fed by a big fermenting house, and the other was a pot distillery. Now, this is a copper pot distillery being installed in a Pennsylvania distillery around the repeal of Prohibition.
To make what?
To make, all I've seen is that this quote, this is the only plant in the United States capable of making Scotch whiskey. It was a barley malt distillery with two, yes, it was fed by a lauter tun. So you can't lauter rye because it's too sticky.
Too sticky.
So what did you lauter? You lautered barley, and they had two stills. One was about 3,600 gallons. The stripping still, and the finished still was over 4,000 gallons. And to my knowledge, these are the only pot stills installed in any American distillery after Prohibition, and were likely the only pot stills running in the country after Prohibition. So that in itself makes that an important distillery to me. We had Joseph Finch. Joseph Finch was a distiller who moved into Thomas Moore's old distillery in Pittsburgh, and his Golden Wedding brand went through the roof, and he expanded his distillery a couple of times before landing at the Shenley Distillery north of Pittsburgh on the Allegheny River, which after Prohibition was named the Joseph S. Finch Distillery for many years. We had Guggenheimer in Freeport, the Germans that we mentioned earlier, who had Freeport is also on the Allegheny River north of Pittsburgh.
Okay.
And when we talk about Monongahela rye, I believe that the entire watershed of the Three Rivers, right? It didn't. It's not exclusively along the Monongahela, but to me it has to be in the area. But Guggenheimer had what may have been the last malting floors in the state of Pennsylvania. They were malting as late as 1908. And they were out of business a year or two before Prohibition, I think 1918. We had Michter's Distillery, the oldest distillery site in the world. When they discovered that distilling had started there in 1753, they ran, not counting the dry years of Prohibition, but they ran from 1753 to 1990, which would have made them 237 years old. So yeah, at the time, the oldest distillery site in the world, operating distillery site in the world. And now that's all gone. We had Continental Distilling in Philadelphia, which was a huge influence after Prohibition, and distilled mostly bourbon. Their Old Hickory bourbon was seems to have been their main product. Who else? The France Distillery in Somerset County. There were a lot of distilleries in Somerset County, which is southeast of Pittsburgh. And many of those distilleries were purchased in the 1890s by Edwin Walters, who was a liquor dealer in Baltimore. And this, to me, helps to defuse the myth of corn in Maryland rye whiskey. Edwin Walters purchased these distilleries in Somerset for the express purpose of having their content bottled and sold through his business in Baltimore. So if Baltimoreans were used to a sweet rye whiskey with corn in it, and they were given Monongahela rye whiskey by a prominent liquor dealer, wouldn't that have Wouldn't that have, they have looked at that and gone, this stuff tastes like crap.
Riots in the street, I would have thought.
You would think, but nothing.
Actually,
Because,
and I'm being facetious, but you would think that there would be some mention of it in Mencken's writing, as booze heavy as that writing is.
yes,
I've never seen such.
yes.
Yeah.
And I really should dig more into Jim Breddy's articles in the Baltimore Sun. He was a columnist for them for many, many years, and really was the preeminent Maryland whiskey historian. I was fortunate enough to meet Jim and actually drink rye whiskey with him and his elderly wife Mary before they both passed away. It was a wonderful afternoon. But this lends into my theory that Maryland rye did not contain corn. We hear from Maryland distillers that their rye was sweeter because it contained corn. Nobody has yet shown me any proof that a mash bill from Maryland contained corn, and I have at least 2 Maryland mash bills in my files that proudly proclaim that they do not use corn. One of them says this is a recipe passed down from father to son since the 60s, which would be the 1860s.
Right.
So where's the corn? Tell me where. Just show me where the corn is. That's all. I'll be happy. Once you show me the Maryland rye, because I believe Maryland rye and Monongahela rye were identical in mash bill. Now there may have been differences, and I will point out that this is where Whiskey Masterclass comes in, because this is where, beyond the mash bill, a distiller can change the flavor of that whiskey. And I do not believe that Maryland whiskey was sweeter because of corn. I believe it was sweeter because of technique.
So let's this puts us right on schedule, because I wanted to get into these other 2 issues in the last half of the show, and here we are. It's halfway, so let's do it. My two big questions for you in this last half of the show are. We have a whole discussion to do about Monongahela rye, which we've really only pecked around the edges of. And the second one, I wanted to talk about the heirloom strains of rye. And there may be some overlap, but let's try and focus on the Monongahela thing. What was Monongahela rye? You had a punch list when we did our session out of West Overton with David Wondrich and Steve Bayshore.
What a great event that was.
That was a great event. That was a fun night. You said no corn, a sweet mash, probably a 3-chamber still, and heated storage, which I think is the one that gets overlooked the most.
Well, you need to know that there has been a monkey wrench thrown into this conversation in recent months. At West Overton, they uncovered a ledger that listed the assets of Abraham Overholt upon his death. And these ledgers contain entries for 3 different kinds of whiskeys. There is pure rye whiskey, there is Monongahela rye whiskey, and there is wheat whiskey. Now, wheat whiskey was fairly common. It was not their primary product at most of these distilleries, but it was fairly common. But now I had always thought that Monongahela rye and pure rye were interchangeable.
Yeah.
It looks as if they are not. So yes, the definition that you laid down, no corn. Now that no corn mash bill could also be an all rye mash bill. Most of those mash bills were somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% rye and 20% barley malt. But there was also the all rye subset, where it was rye and rye malt. And the distilleries that used that process proudly trumpeted the fact that it was an all rye whiskey. Speaking of rye whiskey, here's to you, Herman. Dad's hat.
Oh, cheers.
Boy, that's a delicious, dark, fruity whiskey. Really. And that Overholt 114 is incredibly drinkable at 114, I think.
It really is. And I have no problem whatsoever, which is a little scary, but
slow down, boy.
By the way, hats off. Somebody, we have a comment here. Will tells us that there's just someone who goes by the name Me. Who says they're sitting with 3 fingers of Sazerac rye listening to you jokers? Well, cheers, brother or sister.
Here's to you, from 2 jokers to another.
Damn, I'm gonna have to top up my glasses here.
So I honestly think that maybe the most important aspect of Monongahela rye or pure rye was the heated storage. These distillers were adamant that their whiskey be kept at 70 degrees or above all year round.
Now, were they cycling?
No.
Or steady? Steady.
They just steady. Yes, they would heat it in the winter and shut the heat off in the summer. So, it was obviously a much more expensive way of making whiskey than an unheated rick house. And their warehouses here in Pennsylvania were not rick houses.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah,
And
to clarify, right? We're talking when we say rick house, we're talking about the classic ironclad
open racks. Yes,
open racks, thin skin, thin metal frame skin around the outside. This was not that. These were brick or masonry, right?
Yes, heavy duty warehouses. Where the floors were about 7 feet high. And you could stack barrels 3 high on their sides on sets of rails. So all of these warehouses were heated to keep that temperature up. So they might get warmer in the summer, but in winter they were not allowed to fall much below 70 degrees. And nobody does this now. We have nobody doing heated storage, to my knowledge, in Pennsylvania. And I think that's going to delineate the flavor profile of Monongahela rye much more distinctly moving forward. In fact, I'm headed to Denver in May, planning to go to visit Leopold Brothers. They have the 3-chamber still. Why don't you heat a closet and put some barrels in there?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So to me, that's Monongahela rye whiskey, but now it behooves me to do more research to find out what the difference is between pure rye and Monongahela rye.
Right. Yeah, it's just like everything else. Every time you open a door, there's another door behind it.
Well, it's like I told Aaron Hollis, the education director at West Overton, all I want is the truth. Even if I find that what I thought is wrong, the truth is what we want.
I want to know. Yeah. And I'll stand right up and say, no, actually, we had that wrong.
Yeah.
Here's the latest.
Here's the list.
Yeah, honestly, history is like science. When you find new data, you got to incorporate it. You can't ignore it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although there was one post-prohibition distillery, the France Distillery in Somerset County, that's spelled Frantz.
Okay.
It started as the Abram Schultz Distillery in the 1800s and reopened after Prohibition as France. And they actually there is one small rick house remaining at France, and it's actually a rick house, a tin-clad rick house like Kentucky, but it's only 1 floor, one floor high. Very small warehouse. It's the only rick house I'm aware of in Pennsylvania, and that was only after Prohibition.
Yeah.
Monongahela rye, I think, is a pretty easy concept. The Pennsylvania distillers did not use sour mash for whatever reason.
Why is that?
Even though they were aware of the technique, it would have certainly been in all the trade publications and in the conversations at the time. I don't know. The Kentucky distillers swear that it provides consistency to their product. I'm sure that these Pennsylvania ryes were not inconsistent whiskeys.
Does it make a significant difference in the glass?
That's another good question. I'm sure it has the potential, but to what degree that potential is exercised by individual distillers is up to them. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have an answer either. We did have another question, speaking of which, Dave Gallup, mutual friend, the old Overholt mash bill, undisclosed as far as I know.
You mean the current Overholt mash bill? Yes. I don't believe Beam discloses any of their mash bills.
No.
Which is certainly their right, but once again, that's not the end all and be all to anybody's product. And if
Right.
you tell me that you're not going to tell me your mash bill, I pretty much know what your mash bill is within a certain range.
Sure.
It's not if you're using 8% rye or 10% rye in your low rye mash bill, is that a major difference? It's all low rye mash bill or
Yeah, I
high
mean
rye
it's
mash
a
bill.
difference, but
It
there's
is
so
right. It is
so
a
many.
difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
Once
Yeah.
again, read Whiskey Masterclass. It was just editing the damn thing was an eye opener for me.
I have to say the one review of Whiskey Masterclass that irks me the most is the guy who dismisses it as me just selling tasting whiskey in a different cover. I learned stuff writing Whiskey Masterclass. All right, buddy? Come on. Bullshit.
Hey,
Sorry.
haters gonna hate.
That's right, baby. That's right. So that's our Monongahela rye. Wait, there was one more thing I wanted to ask, and this was something we kind of got into at West Overton that night. Should it be a protected designation? And if it is, what does that mean?
It has to become a protected designation because there is already one distiller who will remain unnamed who is sourcing whiskey from outside of Pennsylvania, putting it in a bottle that says Monongahela rye whiskey and selling it. Okay. What does that do? All that does is ruin things. You're either going to respect this term or you're going to hold it.
Is it going to be statewide though? Or does it have to be in the Three Rivers area? You know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Dad's Hat.
I believe right. There's cannot be a Monongahela rye whiskey because it is not made in Western Pennsylvania. I believe that the watershed of the Three Rivers in Western Pennsylvania should define the territory of Monongahela rye whiskey. And in fact, there's a fellow in Somerset who is getting ready to open a major distillery on the very fringe of the Monongahela watershed, and he's planning to call it Monongahela rye whiskey, and I'm all for that. As long as you fall within that designation. So Dad's Hat can be Monongahela style, but it can't be Monongahela.
Okay.
Much like Leopold Brothers Three Chamber was originally Maryland style rye.
Right.
So you can make the style anywhere, but you can't make the product outside of those parameters. But yes, I think it's going to be critically important, number one, to delineate quality standards for Pennsylvania rye whiskey in general. And this is not, I don't look at this as Empire Rye where it's more nebulous. God bless them for encouraging New York agriculture, but they have very few restrictions on what can be done, which leaves a place.
They actually celebrate that. Yeah.
And that's okay.
Right.
But with Monongahela rye, we have a style. We know a number of the parameters that define the style, and we're either going to hold that term in reverence or we're going to hold it in contempt. And I do not want to see Monongahela rye the term held in contempt. I don't want to see it abused. But I believe we need to delineate what Pennsylvania rye whiskey is first, and then make the Monongahela rye subset part of that conversation.
I don't want to see it abused either.
Yeah.
Yeah. No.
I mean, I've developed such an amazing reverence for what these distillers accomplished and the scale at which they built their businesses, these major industrial sites making tons of whiskey.
Right.
And they're all gone. After Prohibition, I believe there were more than 100 distilleries in Kentucky that reopened. By my count, I only know of 12 in Pennsylvania that did. So for whatever reason, maybe their plants were outdated, maybe they had already scrapped their equipment, but very few of the Pennsylvania distilleries reopened after Prohibition, and that put us at an immediate disadvantage.
Sure. I mean, we had some stock, right?
Oh yeah, there was stock left over.
It just didn't
from Prohibition. In fact, this little sign behind me on the wall is an advertisement from Dillinger in 1933 saying, "We have 18-year-old whiskey for sale by the case at $80 a case." You do the conversion now. That case, the equivalent cost of that case now would be $1,600.
Wow.
They were selling 18-year-old whiskey for $1,600 a case in 1933. And I am fortunate enough to have a bottle of that same whiskey from 1916, bottled in bond in 1941 from Dillinger. So, to those of you listening, that bottle will be opened at some future date at a high-end fundraiser at West Overton, where we will be tasting dusty rye whiskeys. I have no date for this, but we have talked
Hold it up again and show people how dark it is. Just take a look, guys. Wow.
Here's Sam Thompson at 4 years old. Here's Dillinger at 25.
Wow.
4 years, 25 years.
That's like freaking medicine.
And it's clear. It's beautiful
when you get
stuff.
in the glass, nice.
But I don't hold out a lot of hope for what it might taste like.
Oh, you haven't actually tasted it.
Just knowing that overly wooded whiskeys are prevalent around that time period. You know, the prohibition bottled whiskeys I have had, some have been excellent. Most of them have been too woody.
Yeah.
They were in a barrel longer than they were ever intended to be. Now the King's Wedding could be fine stuff. I hope it is. Sure. But who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
So last question, and one that has a lot of relevance today in rye whiskey, I think. Heirloom strains of rye. First,
this is an interesting subject for a number of reasons.
Yes, Is it? Well, first off, do they make an actual difference? And I'm talking about, again, in the glass. That's what I always try to focus on. All these things are real great, but can I taste them? Can I smell them? Can I drink them? Or are they things to put on the label?
I believe. How do I frame this? We hear these distillers talking about the Danko, the Abruzzi, the Rosen. The Rosen we know is a pure strain. Let me back up. Rye is a promiscuous grain. Rye will crossbreed from farm to farm very easily and dilute the genetic integrity of a given strain.
And you're talking about doing it on its own by wind, right?
Correct. The recommendation from the Department of Agriculture back in the day was that you could grow your rye strain for 3 years. And after the third year, you needed to procure new seed to ensure the genetic integrity of that strain.
And this is why they were growing Rosen on an island, right?
On Manitou Island in Lake Michigan. Yes, which they're getting ready to resume.
Right.
They're putting rye back on Manitou Island. So my question is, of all these strains that the brewers are saying, I'm using a Abruzzi, how does your farmer know that? Has your farmer gotten new seed within the last 3 years? Or has this been in their family that they've farmed this rye for the last 30 years and it has now been genetically compromised? The Rosen has been grown from seed, exclusively from seed from the seed bank. So we know that the Rosen that's out there now is a pure strain. I question greatly the rest of these farmers saying this is Danko, this is a Abruzzi, this is whatever, when they really don't know. They no longer know. Now, the advantage they have is that not many people grow rye to seed.
That's true.
So that would help to mitigate the change over time of that genetic strain.
Yeah.
But do they make a difference? I was fortunate. Well, you had some of the Stolen Wolf that I brought up the last time. Stolen Wolf Rosen, and it is a very different product from their regular whiskey. It is much more tropical in flavor to me. So yes, I do believe that these strains can make a difference. I believe that the farmers that are growing them should ensure the integrity of the strain that they're growing and not just keep growing a strain that they've had for 4 generations. So that's my question. Yes, I believe these grains have a chance to make a difference. But once again, let's go back to Whiskey Masterclass. It's one step in the process, one step in a dozen-step process, if not more. So it depends on how that distillate's handled. I'm really looking forward to Pennsylvania rye whiskey in Pennsylvania cooperage. That's going to make a difference too, because back in the day, all these distilleries were in cooperage. They made their own barrels and they were using lumber from Pennsylvania. So that's going to make a big difference too. Much like Mizunara and Gariana and these other crazy strains that are being used,
Well, I mean, just oak grown in different areas, same species.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't. The number of distillers who have told me how differently a whiskey will taste after it comes out of a barrel from wood cut in one state or another state, and it's a different, and it's been subjected to exactly everything else along the line.
Buffalo Trace's single oak project proved that, no doubt. No doubt.
Well, I mean, going far afield, that blind tasting of Waterford Irish malt that you and I did.
Oh my God!
Right?
There were 4 whiskeys that tasted so different, it was unbelievable, and it was all pure different strains of barley.
Otherwise, they were all the same barley, all the same distillation, all the same barreling, all the same aging. The only difference is where the barley was grown. Only difference. Just amazing.
And I used to think Dave Pickerel, God bless him and rest in peace, he talked about terroir in rye whiskey, and this rye from this field tasted like clove. And I thought, well, yeah, okay, maybe Dave. And
I'd say you thought bullshit.
And now I know he's right. He's right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, I think when it comes down to it, and I think we said this when we tasted the Waterford. Dave's thing always was, we don't think there's terroir in whiskey because we've been drinking whiskeys that are made too big. You can't get terroir in a whiskey that is made in that size batches because you've got to pull the grain from more than one place.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Although I don't think that means that the standard grains that our major distillers are using are inferior. There's no way it's used here that
that was the follow-up I wanted to ask. Yes.
Number 2 Yellow Dent Corn makes great whiskey. It makes some of the best whiskey on earth. So
I think to deny that is a little, I don't know, misguided.
Yeah. So what about, we talk about these strains of rye. What about GMO rye? Why can't we engineer rye? Why can't we engineer rye to make flavors that we want? But people get freaked out by GMOs.
Because it'll piss off the Europeans. That's why.
Yeah, but that doesn't take much.
That's true. That's true. We do have 2 other questions. Well, one of them, actually, they both kind of fit together. We've got one question asking, sorry, came in late, what's the common mash bill for Monongahela rye? And another question from, again, Dave Gallup, do we know what strain of rye was used for traditional Monongahela?
I don't know that there was a strain back then. I think you
just planted rye.
You just planted rye. I don't if there may have been, but I kind of doubt that it mattered to them. You just grew rye. And the Monongahela mash bill is usually about 80% rye and 20% malt. Although in the all rye world, and there were all rye Monongahela whiskeys, it would have been about the same proportion of rye to rye malt.
And just to clarify, when we say rye, we essentially mean just grain that has essentially just been harvested and cleaned, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Harvested and cleaned.
And milled. Duh.
And milled. And I will pass along a tidbit that was taught to me by Herman Mihalich. Here, this is good.
Good man.
Where was I? What was I talking about? I just lost that.
Tidbit that Herman passed on to you, other than his whiskey.
Yeah, I might remember it.
Okay, fair enough.
Sorry.
Was it something about milling?
It's my age. Oh no, it was about growing. He said, I went down, I was down there one time looking at a tote of his rye.
Yeah.
And the berries were huge. And I said, oh my gosh, Herman, how do you get this size berry on these ryes? He said, your farmer has to have the courage to leave that rye in the field longer than they are comfortable.
Right.
Because that's when you get these really plump grains.
Because they want to harvest it before it gets knocked over.
They want to harvest it before it gets knocked over, but you got to have the balls to let it in there, man.
Yeah, because if it gets knocked over, you're screwed.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
So I think that's about all the questions we have. I would like to thank everybody who stopped in for doing so. This has been a lot of fun. But we are getting close to wrapping up. Is there anything you wanted to throw in, Sam?
Well, you had asked about how far flung Monongahela rye might have gotten, and one of the premier distilleries in Pennsylvania was the Meadville, Pennsylvania Distilling Company, which is on the way to Erie. Meadville is far north of Pittsburgh, and they were a highly regarded distillery in Western Pennsylvania. But I think that's about as far north as it got.
Okay.
So yeah, it really encompassed most of the western half of the state at the time.
What do you think? What do you think of the? Well, I don't want to get into that discussion, but
I can make it quick.
No, I'm just. I mean, our rye's really hot right now with craft distillers.
Yeah, baby.
Is that going well? Do you think?
I believe it's going really well.
Okay.
There was a time when I called myself the last of the Pennsylvania rye drinkers, because when I came of age in the 70s, there were still two Pennsylvania distilled ryes on the shelf, Overholt and Sam Thompson. And I looked at that and thought, wow, we've got two rye whiskeys. And with Jim Beam and Wild Turkey, that was like it. That was it.
Yeah.
So I watched the decline of rye whiskey distilling, much like I watched the decline of regional brewing in the 70s, and thought someday we are not going to have a distillery in Pennsylvania, and someday we are not going to have a brewery in Pennsylvania. And then the craft brewing thing started, and I was gratified. And the craft distilling thing is absolutely 100% responsible for the resurgence of rye whiskey. And I'm grateful to every one of those distillers who dabbles with that grain, because it's an important part of the history of the industrialization of this country.
I really wanted to get to that, but I knew we'd just go crazy if we did.
Driven in large part by whiskey. So keep
Another
that in
show.
mind.
Another show. Yeah.
Another
Sam, thank you for taking the time and coming on here.
It's always a blast being with you, and thanks to Will for his assistance with this. And
I'm sorry Liz couldn't be with us.
Yeah, me too. You kidding? like I told you before, this show's much uglier without Liz.
Yeah, well, I got to be honest, this show's dumber without her too. So. That's going to wrap it up for this week. I just wanted to let you know who we have in 2 weeks on the next show. That is March 29th, the last Tuesday of the month. We're going to have Becky and Scott Harris from Catoctin Creek Distilling in Virginia. Speaking of rye whiskey, these guys have been making great rye for 13 years. I still remember the first time I tasted their White Dog. I think what was it? Mosby's Revenge, I think they called it. At a whiskey fest in New York, and I'm like, oh God, another freaking white whiskey. Yeah, sure, I'll try that, no problem.
Right.
I was really pretty damn good.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, this is just, and I come here, Becky and Scott, in 2 weeks, because it's going to be a great show. These guys have a lot to say, and they have been making fine whiskey for 13 years. But just a real quick thing, something that I'm just all wound up on right now, white whiskey. And I say that because I remember that Mosby's Revenge, but I also I have tasted some really good white spirit recently. Mike Myers at 291 just sent me. They're still bottling their unaged rye and unaged.
They're in Colorado, aren't they?
What's that?
291's in Colorado.
Colorado, yeah.
Yeah.
And he said, the reason they're making it is because it sells.
Well, good for them.
So I think
because that doesn't happen often.
It does not. It does not. And I think it's a cocktail thing, and I think it's a quality of distillation thing.
Oh, so, no doubt.
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe we have been too quick to brush off white whiskey.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm gonna be thinking and writing about that in the near future. But until then, Sam, it was great to see you, and I look forward to hoisting one together in sometime in the near future.
Thank you for the opportunity of telling people the importance of Pennsylvania distilling back in the day and continuing in the present.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure, buddy.
Likewise, bud. Take care. We'll see everybody.
You too. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.